Shalom lekulam. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the English Zoom program of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to another English event, online event. We're doing this a little earlier in the day than usual because this is a special Yom Hashoah event, and I wanted to do it while it is still sort of formally Yom Hashoah here in Israel. And certainly for those of you in North America, it's still Yom Hashoah for sure. There are a number of topics we could discuss, of course. The Yom Hashoah always brings up the sort of wide array of ways which we can approach thinking about the Shoah and the memory of the Shoah. What I wanted to do was to look at the challenges to remembrance, the challenges to memory posed by political leadership and others in Europe primarily, who for their own various reasons are an obstacle essentially to honest, truthful, just memory and dignity for the victims of the Shoah. And there's really no better person to discuss those things with than my guest today, Dr. Efraim Zuroff, who is the director of the Israel office of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He established the Israel office 37 years ago. He's the center's chief Nazi hunter, also its head of Eastern European affairs. He has discovered the escape destinations all over the world of more than 3,000 suspected Nazi war criminals and facilitated the exposure and prosecution of many of them. In recent years, he's played a key role in identifying the phenomenon of Holocaust distortion in Eastern Europe, which we discussed on his previous appearance here, and we'll certainly touch on, I think, again today. He's the author of 4 books, translated into 15 languages, more than 500 articles on Nazi hunting, Holocaust history, contemporary Jewish life and identity. His most recent book, together with, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Dr. Zuroff can correct me, Ruta Vanagaita. Vanagaita. If she's watching, I apologize, Ruta. Our People Journey with an Enemy, which deals with Lithuanian complicity in Holocaust crimes. And we're going to talk a little about that as well. And Dr. Zuroff was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008. He is, as you will hear from his accent, born in New York, but has been here in Israel for many, many years. He has an MA and PhD in Holocaust Studies at the Hebrew University. Efraim Zuroff, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation, Paul. Always a pleasure to be interviewed by you.
Okay, we're going to sort of discuss a few issues and a few countries in Europe, but let's start with a couple of sort of specific, country-specific questions. You were recently in Macedonia, even appearing on television there for a lengthy interview, I saw. Can you tell us what you were doing in Macedonia? And here's a little teaser for our audience, how you were challenging what I think is a very commonly held view about another country's actions during the Holocaust.
Okay. About a half a year ago, a Jewish member of the Macedonian parliament asked me to try and help her and express support for a proposed legislation that she was presenting to the parliament, which would ban any institutions, cultural institutions, which were spreading or might spread anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism, Holocaust denial, etc. Now, the institutions that she was talking about were actually 2, you could say, like community centers that had been built by the Bulgarians in Ohrid and Bitola. Those are 2 Macedonian cities. And they were named for people who actually were Nazi collaborators. One was named for Mikhailov, and another one for Boris III, who joined the Axis. He led the connection with the Nazis in 1941. And this member of parliament, Rachel Mizrahi, was desperate to try and get external support for the passage of the bill. So I said to her that I'm willing to come out very strongly with a very strong statement of support. And lo and behold, to her surprise, and I wasn't really surprised because I don't really know a lot about Macedonian politics, but to her surprise, the bill passed. And as a matter of fact, I spoke to Rachel yesterday, and those two institutions have been closed down by the Ministry of Justice and the police in Macedonia.
Wow.
In one case, Macedonian citizens actually ripped off the sign for King Boris. So that's an expression of their anger and their refusal to accept the fact that the Bulgarians. What's behind all this? That's the real question.
Yeah.
The real question is that Bulgaria does not want the Macedonians to announce, or in other words, tell the truth that it was the Bulgarians who deported the Jews of Macedonia. Now, a little history. In 1941, Bulgaria joined the Axis. As a prize for joining the Axis, the Nazis turned over 3 areas to Bulgaria. One was Macedonia from Yugoslavia. A second one was Thrace from Greece. And a third one was the city of Pirat from Serbia. And in those areas, a total of 11,343 Jews were rounded up. They were sent to Treblinka. Not one Jew returned alive. And this is what the Bulgarians are trying to hide. Now, the irony of the story is that Bulgaria saved its own Jews.
Right.
There were approximately 50,000 Jews living in Bulgaria. The trains were ready to send them to Treblinka. And then, miracle of miracles, Dmitry Peshev, the vice chairman of the Bulgarian parliament, Metropolitan Stefan, Metropolitan Cyril, the leaders of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, protested vociferously against the deportation of the Jews. And those Jews were not sent to Treblinka, Baruch Hashem, thank God, and 50,000 Jewish lives were saved. Now, today, the Bulgarians want to have Bulgaria declared a state of the righteous. In other words, a country which saved its Jews, which is true. But how can you do that when they deported over 11,000 other Jews in territory under their control, right, to Treblinka, and no survivors?
So where does that application for this righteous nation status stand? Was that they're waiting? And who decides? Yad Vashem decides that?
No. My impression is that they want IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, to give them that designation.
I see. Interesting. Okay. And how was as I said, you were on Macedonian television talking about this. What was the reaction in Macedonia to what you were educating them about?
Well, it depends on your politics.
Right.
Those who have empathy towards Bulgaria, and it might even hope that Macedonia would become part of Bulgaria, which I think the Bulgarians want. They didn't like what I had to say, because I came to emphasize the truth, the historical narrative, that it was the Bulgarians who deported the Jews of Macedonia, and not only of Macedonia, of Thrace and Pirat.
Right. So Greek Jews and Serbian Jews as well.
Serbian
right?
Jews, precisely.
Right. Fascinating. Okay. All right. So I certainly, I'm sure I'm not alone, grew up with this sort of idea that Bulgaria was one of the very few, like there was Bulgaria, there was Denmark, there was, very few European countries that acted to save their Jews. So This is an interesting. This is something of a fly in the ointment for that for that story.
Listen, I have news for you. I have some flies in the ointment about Denmark as well. I can tell you.
Okay, well, maybe we'll get there as well. But before I ask my next question, I should have said at the beginning, it was remiss of me, to our audience, please do write questions in the chat, because we'll get to your questions later on. Okay, so please do write questions for Dr. Zuroff in the chat. Now, your most recent book, which I mentioned, and the name of your co-author I managed to butcher, but
that's badly.
Okay, Peseta. So that book was about Lithuania, and I think one of the I'm interested in why you wanted to focus on Lithuania, because I think many of us might be aware, those of us who've done some reading about the Shoah will be aware that the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, do deserve some special scrutiny for their behavior during the Shoah. So can you, what's special about Lithuania? Why this book about Lithuania?
So let me say that there are several characteristics that took place. There are several things took place in all three of the Baltic countries. One is that more than 90% of the Jews who lived in those countries under the Nazi occupation were murdered. In many cases by the locals themselves. And not only did they also murdered Jews who had been sent to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania from other countries, mostly from Germany, Austria, and in the case of Lithuania, Germany, Austria, France, and what's today the Czech Republic. Wow. And they sent their policemen or auxiliary policemen to Belarus to murder Jews there. And I mean, the difference between the three countries is only in terms of the numbers, because in Lithuania, there were 220,000 Jews who lived under the Nazi occupation, of whom 212,000 were murdered. In Latvia, there were 70,000 Jews who lived under the Nazi occupation, of whom 67,000 were murdered. But in Estonia, the Nazis arrived relatively late. They arrived at the end of July. So of the 5,000 Jews in Estonia, 4,000 were able to escape to the Soviet interior, and only 1,000 Jews were left. But almost every single one of them was murdered by the Estonians and the Nazis. And all three sent their policemen or their auxiliary policemen to Belarus to participate in the murders. The Latvians were involved in the murders in Minsk. The Lithuanians were involved in the murder in 20 different locations, 20 different Jewish communities, 15 Jewish communities, and murdered at least 20,000 Jews. And the Estonians were sent to Novogrodok. That's the place where they were involved in the murder of the Jews.
So Lithuania, and the book, the thesis of the book is essentially what? What were you focusing on with the book?
We were focusing on the lies, the false narrative, right, that the Lithuanians have created. And in order to do that, my co-author, Ruta Vanagaitė, who's Lithuanian, she was a very popular Lithuanian author who actually had never written about Lithuanian history or about the Shoah, but suddenly discovered that her family members, her grandfather and her aunt's husband, were involved in the persecution of Jews and actually in the murder of Jews.
Wow.
So, what she did was totally counterintuitive. In Lithuania, very few people are willing to face the truth to this day, even though Lithuania is independent 32 years already. I could give you some terrific examples of that. She actually the way she started off to atone for this was to create a program called Being a Jew. And she got a grant from the EU to take non-Jewish children, Lithuanian school children, to the synagogue in Vilna, and to have them be addressed by members of the community to talk to them about Jewish history, Jewish holidays, Jewish food, all sorts of things, to let them at least find out some information. She said when she grew up, she knew absolutely nothing about Jews. So, but the grant that she got required her to also have a conference on Holocaust education. And she asked the people involved in the Holocaust in Lithuania, since she had no idea who to invite, whom can she invite? So they said you could invite everyone except two people, Efraim Zuroff and David Katz. David Katz was a brilliant Yiddish scholar who taught in Lithuania for many years until his opposition to the government's cover-up of the crimes. Basically, he was fired, and he lost his job at Vilna University. So I don't know exactly where he is now, whether he's back in Wales or he's in Lithuania. But he has a wonderful website, which I would encourage anyone who's interested in this issue should take a look at it. It's called defendinghistory.com. And he has chronicled the developments regarding the what we call Holocaust distortion. So anyway, so Ruta said to the people, what's going to happen if I invite them? Are there going to be fist fights? What do you expect? They said, no, there are no fist fights, but we don't want to sit with them. We don't want to have anything to do with them. So Ruta, being Ruta, she's a real iconoclast. She, of course, invited me. Invited us. And I couldn't go to the conference because I had committed to lectures in the United States. It was on the time of Yom Hashoah, around this time that year. But I went to Lithuania on March 16th, or 15th, to protest against a neo-Nazi march in Lithuania. And that was in 2015. It was one of 4 neo-Nazi marches that I went to in the Baltics, one in Estonia, one in Latvia, and 2 in Lithuania in 1 month. And we started talking, and we said we have to do something together. The point was this: I had run out of suspects to try and bring to justice in Lithuania, because the Lithuanians did everything possible to turn the whole judicial process into a farce. 3 people were actually put on trial because of pressure from the United States, Israel, believe it or not, at that point, long before that, and the Jewish organizations, and they did everything possible not to turn these trials into a very important history lesson for Lithuanian society. In other words, not a single one of the defendants was obligated to show up at the trial. Not a single one sat 1 day in jail. Listen, if there's no punishment, maybe there's no crimes.
Yeah.
So in any event, we decided we're going to go to many places of mass murder. There's 234 mass graves, Holocaust graves in Lithuania. We will interview people who lived through that period, and we will ask them about the identity of the killers, the motivation of the killers, what role anti-Semitism, what role did alienation between Jews and Lithuanians influence those events. And we for 40 days, not consecutively, thank God, because if I had done it consecutively, I would have lost my mind completely. It was the most heartbreaking thing you could ever imagine. Every day that we went on this journey, 2 to 3 places of mass murder, Kaddish, El Balei Rachamim, and many, many tears.
Wow. And
this has never been done before. In other words, I'm a descendant of the victims. I'm actually named for my great uncle, Rabbi Efraim Zuroff, who was murdered, his wife Bela, his kids, Hirsch and Eliyahu. And Ruta was a descendant of the participants. So it was a very unique journey. And,
wow.
And it was added, in other words, what we added, we taped our conversations as we went from place to place. And in addition, Ruta did research in the archives of the KGB where the transcripts of the trials conducted by the Soviets against the perpetrators were there. And she focused on the political leadership. Most people don't know this, but there was a year of Soviet occupation before the Nazi invasion. In other words, the Soviets invaded Lithuania in June 1940. They were there for a year before the Nazi invasion. During that time, almost all the leaders of the Lithuanian political parties escaped to Berlin. And they were sitting in Berlin under the protection of Hitler and Himmler and proclaiming their support for the Third Reich and sending messages of incitement against the Jews into Lithuania. So it's no wonder that in 42 places in Lithuania, there were physical attacks on Jews even before the first Nazi showed their face.
Yeah. Wow.
So anyway, the only reason the book got published in Lithuanian, that was the first edition in Lithuania, was because Ruta was such a popular author. The previous book had sold 50,000 copies in Lithuania, in a country of 2.3 or 2.2 million people.
Wow.
It was about advice to women at 50. Okay? And when we went to the publisher to tell them that we're writing another book, before she could say anything, the publisher said, Ruta, you had such a great success. You wrote a book about women. Why don't you write a book about men? So Ruta said, that's a very nice idea, and I will do it. But before that, you're going to print the book that I'm writing now. Oh, Ruta, what are you writing about? The Holocaust. Gott in Himmel. You should have seen their faces. They didn't know what to do with themselves. They said, but you know what? Okay, we'll do it if you don't tell anybody what you're writing about until the day of the launch. So that's what we did.
Wow. Wow. It's a way.
The book became a bestseller. 20,000 copies. Most read book in public libraries for 3 years. But what we found out was the people who read that book were the young people who grew up in Lithuania and in European Union, and the people who lived through the war. The middle generation, like say from 30 to 70, no one wanted to touch the book. No one wanted to read the book.
Very interesting. Right. So, if the younger people are reading it, I guess that's hopeful, right?
That is hopeful. Anyway, yeah. The eighth language is about to be published now in Dutch. It's come out in English, of course, Polish, Russian, Hebrew, Lithuanian, Swedish, and that's about it. It was supposed to come out in Ukrainian, but the war it prevented it from happening.
Okay, I've just put up the link in the chat for the Amazon page, so people can go to the Amazon page if they want to check out that book and purchase it. Okay, let's move on to some sort of broader issues, which are also relevant to what you just discussed with Lithuania. But I think one of the Holocaust distortion is something that you've mentioned in passing here, and we discussed it at length in a previous appearance. But effectively, we're talking about where countries are not denying the Holocaust, but are rather downplaying or completely sort of hiding their own the complicity of their own country's nationals in the Holocaust itself, and making it all about the Nazi occupation and the actions of the Germans. Okay. Right?
I'm very glad that you brought this up. This is very true. None of these countries deny the Holocaust.
Right.
They have changed the narrative. Now, what you have to remember is that only in Eastern Europe did collaboration with the Nazis include participation in systematic mass murder. In other words, think France, think Holland, Belgium, for example, Italy, Greece. Those countries, ultimately, they persecuted the Jews. They passed laws defining who's a Jew. They denied the Jews' livelihood. And ultimately, what they did was to take the Jews, arrest the Jews, bring them to the train station or to the port. In Norway and Greece, they were taken by boat. And then to send them somewhere else to be murdered by someone else. That somewhere else was Eastern Europe. in the death camps, and those someone else were the Nazis, of course, and their local helpers. But the local helpers did most of the damage, not in places like well, to some extent, there were, let's say, in a place like Treblinka, there were only 20 Germans, and the 100 guards that were there were mostly Ukrainians and Latvians, okay, and some Lithuanians. But the major damage that was done by the Eastern Europeans is in the Holocaust of bullets. In other words, the 1.5 million Jews murdered between 41 and 43 by the Einsatzgruppen and the collaborators. So think just a couple of sort of facts that demonstrate and explain the importance. The number of people, Germans, who were in the Einsatzgruppen were somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. And they covered an area of 1,500 kilometers from Tallinn in Estonia, all the way in the north, all the way down to Odessa. Now, they were able, and the method of murder was shooting. Every single Jew had to be shot individually, had to be murdered individually. In some cases, they used to smash the heads of children with rocks, with boulders, to save a bullet, if you could imagine such horror. But everyone else was shot, men, women, and children, elderly, etc. And that is very labor intensive. So if, for example, and this is an amazing statistic that I learned not that long ago, if there were less than 1,000 Germans in Lithuania during the Nazi occupation, and they murdered 212,000 Jews, 90% of them were shot, who did the killing?
Who was doing it? Yeah. Right. So this is the and obviously this kind of thing, this Holocaust distortion is not limited to Lithuania. It's rife throughout Eastern Europe. And
Lithuania, I sometimes say, is the locomotive. In other words, initiatives that are, let's say, legal initiatives to make it a criminal offense to deny that that the Holocaust was genocide, or that communism was genocide. By the way, you can go to jail for 2 years. Next thing you know, the same law was passed in Latvia, the same law was passed in Estonia.
Wow.
And the Lithuanians were the people, I think, who the key movers behind something called the Prague Declaration. Prague Declaration was signed on June 3rd, 2008, I believe. And it's basically the manifesto of the movement. Now, what you mentioned, one of the very important goals, in other words, they changed the narrative to hide or minimize the role played by their people. But there are three other important issues here. One is they want to try and convince Europe that communist crimes were just as bad or worse than Nazi crimes.
Right.
The communist crimes are genocide. And this is super important, because if they are, that means that Jews committed genocide, because they were Jewish communists who got, joined the KGB and were involved in these crimes. So, of course, how can you Jews complain about us if your people committed genocide? And if everyone is guilty, then
you did some bad things, we did some bad things. Let's just call it quits, kind of.
Right. Okay. Now, goal number 3 is the issue of heroes. Who are the heroes of these countries?
Right.
Naturally, people fought against the Soviets after World War II, and that's perfectly understandable, very logical. And I would have no, opposition if it weren't for the fact that some of these people were mass murderers during the Shoah. Someone like Jonas Noreika, who was the liaison with the Nazis in northwest Lithuania, where they murdered tens of thousands of Jews, it wouldn't bother me because he was a strong fighter against the Soviets, which it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But so this is a third point, and the fourth point is actually quite important. They are pushing for a joint memorial day for all the victims of totalitarian regimes.
Who's they? When you say they are pushing?
In other words, the people in the Prague Declaration, the people who signed on the Prague Declaration, was signed by 33 scholars and politicians, etc., mostly from Eastern Europe, of course. And even the only Jewish MP in Lithuania signed it because he's probably the guy who wrote it, if I know how these things work. In any event, so if such a day would be established, what do you need International Holocaust Day for?
Right.
And it's turning out, I'd say from my perspective, that day is becoming more and more important, because when you have 2 days to commemorate the Shoah, at least one day you can devote to mourning and the sadness of the loss and the all of that, and on another day you could deal with political problems or other problems that plague the issues and are preventing Holocaust education or fighting against Holocaust distortion or things like that.
Just a question on this. These things that you've been talking about, the Holocaust distortion, naming, honoring heroes who were mass murderers of Jews. How does this affect the admittedly small Jewish communities in these countries?
Okay, it's very difficult for these Jewish communities to fight the good fight because of their size.
Yeah.
So Lithuania has maybe 4,000, 4,500, maximum 5,000 Jews, many of whom aren't even Litvaks. In other words, these are Jews. They were mitnachalim who were sent by the Russians during the time of the Soviet Union to de-Russify these countries.
Right.
Okay. So it's hard for them. Latvia has about 12,000 Jews. Estonia has about 3,000, maybe 4,000 Jews. So, I mean, altogether, it's nowhere near the size that they had, except Estonia, of course, before the Shoah.
Yeah.
Vibrant, incredible Jewish communities, literate and committed. And it's the heartland of committed Jews in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So our hope was, for example, to empower these communities. In other words, to get them on board. And I mean, listen, they were in favor of prosecuting the Nazis, but the leadership there sometimes has other interests that prevent it from fighting against the community. And in a small community of a few thousand people, it's very hard for them to really win political battles. Now, from my experience, what I've seen is some of the best allies that we had in fighting for the prosecution of Nazi war criminals were journalists. But in those countries, we couldn't find a single journalist who was going to support us, except in Latvia, from the Russian minority, who are considered a fifth column by the Latvians.
Yeah.
In other words, in order to win these battles, you need local allies. This is precisely why I was so excited when Ruta told me, I nearly fell off my chair, that her family was involved in the Shoah and she wants to make up for it. I mean, it's like from heaven, you know what I mean? It's like mashu unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, there are some righteous among the nations out there. Okay, there are some questions coming in. I want to ask one more question of my own, and we'll get some questions from the audience. But please do keep writing questions in. I want to touch on the Russia-Ukraine situation, primarily because it's something that's in the news so much in the context of the war, of course, and the atrocities being committed there. But how do you see this? I mentioned the state of Holocaust remembrance and education in those countries. And I'm thinking particularly of, in the case of Russia, the way the war has been, firstly, it's not allowed to be called a war in Russia, of course, special operation, but also that it's a special operation to denazify Ukraine, right?
Right, 100%. February 24th, that was Putin's statement.
Right. And on the other side, we see, Ukraine not exactly dealing properly, to say the least, with its own Second World War treatment of its Jews. And I think just recently, I was reading of this. I think there's a street in Kiev which is going to be named after Vladimir Kubiovich, who was he was the head of the Waffen SS, the Ukrainian Waffen
SS. Not the head, but one of the people who was instrumental in creating the Halachina division or the Galicia division of
So this is exactly what you're talking about. This is the heroes that are being honored. By
the way, Vitaly Klitschko, who was a famous boxer and is today mayor of Kiev, apparently said that he would prevent
Kubiovich, I have written here. I just learned the name today.
Kubiovich. He would prevent Kubiovich from being named for the street being named after him. But it remains to be seen whether or not that's possible. I don't know.
Huh. Interesting.
It was the public vote, by the way. It was a digital vote, and the people voted. It wasn't a certain, it wasn't like city council.
Right.
Kubiovich was the most popular person among the names that came up for the naming of the street. Okay, so first of all, the Ukrainians are major distorters of the Holocaust. Their biggest heroes are Stefan Bandera and Roman Shushkevich. So Stefan Bandera was the head of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, whose men joined the Nazis when they invaded Ukraine, were actively participants in the mass murder of the Jews of Lviv. Today they call it Lviv, the Ukrainians call it Lviv, it's Lvov. In other words, from Poland, and from the Jews called Lvov. And Roman Shushkevich, who was the commander of the UPA. The UPA was the Ukrainian army, which was founded in 1943 and killed tens of thousands of Poles and at least 10,000 Jews. And recently, Bandera's birthday was declared a national holiday. And Shushkevich had a new football stadium in Ternopil, they call it Ternopil, built in Ternopil. So, I mean, Zelensky came to the Knesset and said, we helped you in the Shoah, so why don't you help us? For every righteous Ukrainian, I think we can find 100 Ukrainians who murdered Jews. So it's a very sad story. I mean, but having said that, it doesn't mean that Ukraine is a Nazi country. Right. That's not the case. So, I mean, Putin's claim to denazify Ukraine is absurd. The same way that the Ukrainians claim that the attacks on Bucha were the Holocaust of the 20th century, of the 2022, 23. Yeah. Okay? So each side is lying. Each side is trying to harness images from the Holocaust. And, in a certain sense, it's proof of our success in convincing the world that the Holocaust was the worst tragedy in the annals of human history. And we see it again and again. We see it with PETA, the organization to defend animals, the anti-abortionists. They all think that their tragedy is the Shoah, which it isn't, of course. That's
even anti-COVID
vaccines, right? Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, let's thank you very much for answering my questions so fully. Let's get to some questions from the audience, and maybe I'll have some more if there's time as well. So firstly, to go back to when we were talking about Bulgaria and its righteous nation status, which is not deserved, as you've explained. So it was actually a statement rather than a question, but I'll put it to you anyway. Rosalie and then Anne both mentioned Albania as being a nation that deserves righteous nation status. How would you weigh in on that?
Okay, so it's a little complicated because the Albanians in Kosovo formed their own SS unit. And they rounded up the Jews and they sent them to camps like Bergen-Belsen. So in Albania, it's true that there were more Jews at the end of the war than there were before the war, okay? And the concept of Besa, concept of protecting guests and sheltering guests is something that's quite strong in Albania, and part of the reason why some Jews were saved there. But the Albanians as a people are not free of guilt. So it's a mixed picture. Like, listen, I promised you to tell you about Denmark.
Oh yeah, Denmark, right.
What we know today is, first of all, I mean, you can't ignore the fact that the Danish underground helped ferry the Jews of Sweden to safety. The overwhelming majority, except for the 452 Jews who were elderly Jews who didn't cross the bay, remained in Copenhagen and were deported to Theresienstadt, where several dozen died from the conditions in Theresienstadt. But today we know two other things. One is that 6,000 Danes volunteered for the Waffen-SS, and they served in the Viking Division. And the Viking Division was involved in the mass murder of Jews. That's one thing. Today we also know, because of research by two wonderful Danish historians, Dennis Larsen and a guy named Strada, Thurston Strada, there was a camp in Belarus, in Babrusk, which was run by Danes, in which 98% of the Jews who were there were murdered or died of the conditions. So, in other words, the picture, Denmark deserves our admiration for saving its Jews who were there, but Danes were part of the crimes committed against other Jews.
Right.
And we see this in Bulgaria is another case. In other words, Bulgaria saved its own Jews, deported the Jews who were in the territories where the people, which were next to Bulgaria, by joining the Axis. And in other countries, in France, for example, the people most likely to be deported were the foreign Jews who had not obtained French citizenship. They also deported some French Jews who had French citizenship. And it was Laval who said to the Germans, we'll also deport the children, even though the Germans didn't even ask for them. So, I mean, there's a lot of nuances here, and we have to be very accurate and try to make sure that we don't falsify history.
Right. My great grandparents on my mother's side were deported from Paris to Auschwitz. I think they had French citizenship. They were originally from Syria, but I'm not sure if they had French citizenship or not. Okay. There's a question here it's a sort of two-headed question from Shmuel, talking about Israel and Israeli. It says, what can Israel do? It's two questions in one. What can Israel do to ensure Holocaust remembrance around the world? And what can it do to increase Holocaust remembrance or awareness inside Israel?
Well,
how long have you got?
How many years have you got?
Yeah.
For this program. Okay, so first of all, I think that I would differentiate between countries whose assistance is absolutely necessary to help protect the state of Israel and ensure its survival. Okay, we're not talking about the United States here. We're not talking about Germany. We're talking about three, for example, little countries who need us far more than we need them. Like Baltic countries, that's a good example. Even in other countries like Croatia or Hungary, we have been in a position in these last few years to be far stronger or far more, how should I put it? Assertive. And we can say to these countries, listen, we're very happy that you, by the way, one of the questions regarding this issue was the apology, and that the countries made when their head of state visited Israel. So the apology was always made in Israel, by the way, at Yad Vashem. And when the guy went back to his home country, he was attacked by the local press. Why did you apologize to the Jews? Maybe the Jews should apologize to us. What for? For communism. So, and they need us far more than we need them. And I think it's possible that in a very polite way to say to these countries, listen, we are very happy that we're on good relations now. We cherish your friendship. We want to, develop the relations between us, but we cannot accept the fact that you are basically pushing off all, you're hiding the crimes of your own nationals. For your own good, admit what happened. You have a black shadow hanging over your country ever since you became independent. That black shadow is the lies you're telling about the Holocaust. That's one of the reasons. Lithuania, for example, is emptying out. When Lithuania got independence, there were 3.5 million people. Today, it's 2.2 or 2.3. So why are the people leaving? For a lot of reasons. They're leaving for financial reasons, economic opportunity, but part of it is also who wants to live in a country of mass murderers who murdered their own neighbors, who did nothing against them. Okay, so what about the question? The second part is in Israel.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, the trips are very important. And I'm a very staunch supporter of the trips to Poland. My last 10 years in Miluim, I spent in the education department of the IDF, in the Speakers Bureau. And I spoke to a whole cross-section of Israeli society. The smartest, the most intelligent soldiers, the least intelligent, least educated, Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, mixture, religious, not atheist, Masorati, traditional, a whole cross-section of thousands. I actually spoke to thousands of soldiers. And two things surprised me. We're talking now, this is 20 years ago. Two things surprised me. One was the level of knowledge about the Holocaust, and the other one was the sense of identification with the victims of the Holocaust. This got across all the machitzot, all the differences. It was a wonderful thing, absolutely wonderful. And I was trying to think to myself, how did this happen? And my answer was two factors. One, the bagrut, the matriculation was the subject of the Holocaust was obligatory for bagrut, for matriculation, and two, the trips to Poland. And I'm telling you, it did wonders for these kids. Yeah. Now, it may not have done for every single kid, but the bulk of the people were very, very positively affected. It made them stronger in their determination to live in Israel, to fight for Israel if they have to. And this is so necessary.
Yeah. You're fair. Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm just putting in the chat a piece that Dr. Zuroff wrote today, which touches on this issue of Poland and it's how Israel should or shouldn't be behaving towards these countries. But please read that at your leisure. But I want to. There's a couple of excellent questions here from Jonathan. One of them is about Ukraine, and he says, "How do you square Ukrainian admiration for its war criminals, it's mass murderers, with the election of Zelensky, the Jewish Volodymyr Zelensky, as president?"
Listen, for all practical purposes, Zelensky is a good Ukrainian. And he happens to have been born to two Jewish parents, which is actually relatively rare in Ukraine also. But he's trying to play the Jewish card because he wants certain arms and ammunition from Israel. And Israel has to be very careful because we need to have good relations with Russia because of what's going on in Syria and Lebanon. So we have to play it's a very delicate situation. And listen, most countries are not providing Ukraine with the offensive weapons, and neither are we. But they have this crazy idea that the Iron Dome will solve their problems in terms of the defense against the missiles. But actually, the Iron Dome is not capable of deflecting or neutralizing the missiles that the Russians are firing. So, I mean, this is just like it's a straw man.
Interesting. And another question here from Jonathan about Germany. And this gets to something which I know you've written about quite recently. He says, another paradox, he says, what are your views regarding, on the one hand, Germany's impressive memorialization of the Holocaust, and I would add education and other things, with its record for actually prosecuting and punishing war criminals.
Ooh, he hit the nail on the head. I'm telling you, that is the big, how should I put it? The big question. When it comes to reparations, paying for the crimes, Germany has been amazing. Okay, when it comes to education, they're doing a reasonable job, and they're trying very hard to educate people about the Holocaust and to warn of the dangers of fascism, Nazism, etc. When it comes to justice, as they say in Israel, yuck. That means garnished or nothing. I'll give you some figures. West Germany took over the judiciary, its own judiciary, only in 1949. That's when the Allies left.
Yeah.
So from 1949 to 1985, there were 200,000 investigations of Nazi war criminals. 120,000 of them were charged. Less than 7,000 were convicted and punished. Now, I'll tell you another thing. By the way, Professor Lawrence Douglas of Amherst is a law professor who follows Nazi war crimes very carefully. He wrote a brilliant book, I have to say, called The Right, Wrong Man. It was about the Demjanjuk trials, and he compared Demjanjuk's trial to Eichmann's trial in Israel and the Nuremberg trials.
Wow.
Now, in Nuremberg, there were special categories of criminality that were created precisely for the Nuremberg trials. But the German judiciary refused to use them in Germany because they said it's ex post facto. Now, that's true. It was ex post facto, but they certainly far better reflected the crimes that were being tried because of the uniqueness of the Shoah and the Shoah's the crimes in the Shoah. So they were prosecuting people under an 1870 Prussian edict. And for quite a few years, the requirement to prosecute a Nazi was that the person had to have committed a specific crime against a specific victim, and done so because of racial hatred was his motivation. Now, after the 60s, they dropped the last part, but until Germany very dramatically changed its prosecution policy in 2008 and put Ivan Demjanjuk on trial, you still had to prove that a defendant had committed a specific crime against a specific victim, which is almost impossible to prove these days. Now, instead, any person who served in a death camp, that means a camp with apparatus for mass annihilation. The 6 death camps were, in other words, Chelmno had gas fans, the others had gas chambers, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. All camps with a very high mortality rate, just by service alone, and they're tried for accessory to murder. The guinea pig, so to speak, was Demjanjuk, which was wonderful because otherwise he never would have been able to leave the United States. In other words, he could have remained in the United States forever and died in the United States. But the Germans decided to extradite him. They put him on trial. They convicted him. And that was the precedent for the 7 other trials that have taken place since, only one of which was stopped for medical reasons. The other 6, they were all convicted, sentenced to prison. But unfortunately, in German law, until your appeal is completed, you don't go to jail. So Oscar Groening died a day before he was supposed to go to the jail, or 2 days before he was supposed to go to jail. And the others have not gone to jail. But listen, one of the things I have to say is that any justice is better than no justice. And one of the products of these trials was, for example, an absolutely fabulous verdict by Judge Anne Meyer Goring, no relation to Herman, we checked, okay, who tried a watchtower guard in a juvenile. Another thing, by the way, if you served before 21, the age of 21, you're tried in a juvenile court, which is absurd. In other words, the secretary of Stutthof, who worked there from June 43 until April 45, when Stutthof was evacuated, and said that she knew nothing. She had no idea what was going on there, but she regrets everything. But in any event, she got a suspended sentence. Why? Because she was tried in a juvenile court. So what's the deal? I understand if someone, let's say a kid, 18, 19, 20, commits a crime, you don't want to put him in jail with hardened criminals. It might ruin his life forever. So you give him a suspended sentence. So what do we do with the Watchtower guard who served 2 years in the Watchtower in Stutthof? We have to find a concentration camp with the Watchtower and put him in the Watchtower again. Otherwise, he won't go to jail. No, but seriously, her verdict basically proved that in a tragedy, the scope of the Holocaust, there's no such thing as a small cock. That term is wrong. Every single person who was there in any capacity was helping the Nazis murder innocent human beings for no good reason other than the fact that they were Jews.
Right.
So that is something that we published this in our annual report, and we're trying to encourage schools and educators to use it and to teach it in their classrooms. And that's very important, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question here from Moni. Sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's outside of your sort of area of Eastern Europe, but I'm sure you'll have something interesting and important to say on it. It's about, I mean, he's asking about the US and the fact that in the US, there's, the now known story of America turning back ships full of Jewish refugees, of not doing what it could have done, should have done, to help to provide refuge for Jews. We actually had an event here at the Wiesenthal Center not long ago, talking about the efforts of the Bergson group to raise awareness of this. But the question he's asking really is, what can be done to raise awareness of that in the way that, say, slavery is now something that all Americans know about? What can be done to raise historical awareness of that? I just and he doesn't mention this, but I'll just add, I know there's a documentary series done by Ken Burns about the Holocaust America. I haven't seen it myself. I don't know how it's been received by people, by experts like yourself, but that's something that was some attempt to address that issue.
Okay, so I did not see the whole series. I only saw the first half hour, the first episode, for a variety of technical reasons. My impression is that it was somewhat apologetic. They dealt with the issue of the refugees, but they kept on emphasizing the fact that public opinion in America did not want refugees, which is one of the reasons why Roosevelt did everything possible to limit the number of Jews who were entering the United States. But listen, first of all, there's something called the Wyman Institute, which is run by Rafi Medov, who's trying to get across those ideas, those, trying to make corrections in museums.
He's spoken here, I think.
Yeah, he has. No, he's spoken, he's written books, he's spoken. It's very, very difficult because the subject is so unpleasant and so problematic to get a country to, I cannot imagine in this generation someone, an American president, who will go to Israel and to Yad Vashem and say, I want to apologize for the misdeeds, not crimes, misdeeds of my predecessors. In other words, maybe it'll happen. Maybe 100 years from now it'll happen. Do you think the British have ever said, sorry, we prevented Jews from entering Palestine? But I'll tell you, there's an interesting story, because Gary Lineker, who's a very famous footballer, one of England's best, recently said that the policies, the refugee policies of the conservative government remind him of the Nazi, remind him of, dark times. So people, right away, they started calling me up. Is this the Shoah? Well, of course it is not the Shoah, but you know what it is? It's what the Brits did to prevent Jews, Holocaust survivors from coming to Israel. That's exactly what it's like. That's what it's like.
Very interesting.
But listen, all of this proves the success that we've had, people who've devoted their lives to studying the Shoah, teaching the Shoah, researching the Shoah. We've convinced the world that the Shoah is the worst tragedy. So if it's the worst tragedy, everyone wants to get a piece of it or to be something similar so that they can get support and get, people will join them and maybe help them try and win the battle that they're fighting. The anti-abortionists, the PETA, the animal, people who protecting animals, and I can go on and on and on.
Yeah. We've just had a couple of, I assume, Canadian audience members, viewers, who've reminded us that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did in fact apologize for Canada on behalf of Canada.
None is too many. That's the name of the book by Irving Abella and Harold Trapper about Canadian immigration policy. The person who was in charge of, he was actually the Minister of Mines for some reason, Frederick Blair. When it came to admitting Jews, he said, none is too many.
None is too many.
This quote, it's very well known in Canada, and it's a very horrible story, I have to say, as we all understand. So it's not only the Americans. Listen, when the Americans called for convened the Evian Conference in July of 1938, which is supposed to help solve the refugee problem, they said in the invitation, no country will be asked to change its quotas. So if you can't change the quotas, how are you going to do anything?
Right.
And Palestine was not on the agenda because the Brits said, we won't participate if Palestine is on the agenda. One country willing to take Jewish refugees.
Right.
Very sad story all around, believe me. There's very few real righteous tzaddikim when it comes to the Shoah.
Right. No, no, I think certainly one of the messages we're taking from this talk with you is that whilst it's true that you can certainly look at different governments of different countries and leaders who have performed much more honorably than others, there's no country that has entirely clean hands in terms of its population.
I'll give you another example that I'm sure almost no one knows about. In Finland, Hitler asked Mannerheim to send the Jews to the camps. Mannerheim refused to do it, okay? But Finland actually deported to Auschwitz 8 Jewish refugees who had not obtained Finnish citizenship. They turned over Jewish Russian POWs to who they captured because they fought with the Germans in 2 wars against the Russians. They turned them over to the Gestapo. And it was an automatic death sentence.
Right.
And the third thing is that the Finns allowed the Germans to recruit people who wanted to join as volunteers, to join the SS. And where did they send them? They sent them to the Viking Division. So a few years ago, a Finnish historian found a letter that one of these men, there were 1,408 Finnish SS volunteers, sent to his parents saying, we didn't come here to kill Jews. No, what's the pshat, as we say? What's the simple explanation? That they were busy killing Jews.
Yeah. So
in the last 2 cases, I wrote in each case to the Finnish president. In one case, it was Tarja Halonen in 2003 about the fact that the Jewish POWs were turned over to the Gestapo. And in 2018, it was Niinisto, the current president of Finland, about the issue of the SS volunteers. And in each case, the Finns, to their credit, mounted a very, very serious historical investigation to find out exactly what had happened. And in each case, they had to admit that they had done the wrong thing.
Wow. Well, I think we'll conclude there, and I think we'll conclude that also because it's an example, Efraim, of where you have of your activity over so many years on this issue, and we thank you for that, for being this sort of stalwart fighter for justice and for memory, which I think is important to all of us as Jews, and on this day above all. So thank you so much for everything you've done. Thank you for joining us today and enlightening us with your with all the knowledge that you have on these topics and the work that you've been doing and your visits across Europe, your campaigns and other things. I recommend everyone check out the latest book by Efraim Zuroff and his co-author, Our People. There was the link I put in earlier, but you can certainly just go on Amazon and find it there. Our People, if you just write Our People and Efraim Zuroff, you'll find it. And I thank everyone for joining us. I hope everyone has had a meaningful Yom Hashoah. I wish everyone a meaningful week ahead in this important, significant week for Israel and the Jewish people. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Efraim, once again.
Okay, Paul, I want to thank you. First of all, every time you do a great job, and
thank you.
I'm able to reach a very important audience and try and tell them, what has to be told, and it's a real privilege and an honor for me. Thank you very much.